disabilities, loose from all that hinders me. Nothing can hold me now. I'm standing on solid ground. The word of the Lord. I've got the victory over my enemies. Who the Son sets free is free indeed. My chains are broken. Thank God I am loose. Oh yes I am. Yes I am. I am loose. Oh yes I am. Yes I am. I am loose.
The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep its silence before him. Shalom. We greet you on this day during this amazing Holy Week on Maundy, Thursday, and we greet you in the name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ in the spirit of Shalom, which is what we say here at Salem Bible Church. We're so thankful and glad that you've made your way to stream and to worship with us on this sacred day. It's hard to believe that more than 2,000 years ago, that this was the day leading up to that great meeting that our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ had on Calvary's Hill. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes on him should not die, but have everlasting life. The Lord came that we may have life and have it more abundantly. Everything that we know to be true, all of the reasons that allow us to call ourselves Christians, to worship God in spirit and in truth, come down to this 1 week. And it's on this particular day that we're excited to reflect upon. What were times like 2,000 years ago? What happened in the Lord's Supper? What were some of the conversations and holy relics that manifested themselves on that sacred day? We hear sermons, we hear lessons, we hear songs that are all homages to this particular Maundy, Thursday. But on today here at Salem Bible Church, you're going to get an introspective historical view of what happened and what things were like on that day on Maundy, Thursday. We're excited here at Salem because we have an amazing organization called the Chosen People, who are Jewish people culturally and religiously. However, they are Messianic Jews, which means that these type of Jewish people are Jewish people by culture, but accept Jesus Christ as the Son of God and as the risen Savior. This particular person who's going to be presenting on today from Chosen People will be giving us different relics, historical context of what the Passover, the Last Supper, and a myriad of things that you don't want to miss. What better way for us to celebrate Maundy, Thursday and commemorate what happened than to actually go into a time machine, into the text, and see with our own eyes and experience through our own humanistic experiences what happened during that time. The goal is to give you context that we may gain and glean and be in the spirit of what Christ did for us as he was making his way to Calvary's Hill to die for you and for me. We hope you enjoyed. But before we go into the sanctuary to see this amazing presentation, we want you to remember our drive-through will be this Saturday, the day before Easter Sunday morning, Resurrection Sunday morning, from 9 to 11 at our Atlanta campus and from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. at our Stonecrest campus. You'll be the recipient of a special bag. It's going to have your communion, your bread, your wine. We've got some other trinkets and gifts, a journal that you'll be able to write upon, and a lot of other great things for our youth and our children will be there as well. Everything will be done in a safe way to where there's no contact. All of you will be protected from a safety protocol and procedures that we've implemented, as well as all of our volunteers as well. You'll drive through, you'll be in a position that if you need envelopes, if you want to make any donations and gifts, you'll be able to do that at that time. Don't forget about that. Lastly, and certainly not least, we look forward to seeing you on Resurrection Sunday morning at 8 and 11 at Facebook, Salem Bible Ministries, and SalemBibleChurch.org, just as you consume the content every Sunday morning. God is going to take us to a new dimension, and we can't wait to see what's going to happen on that day. So come with us now as we go into part 1 of Maundy Thursday, and part 2 will be on tomorrow, Good Friday. We hope you enjoy, and we'll see you soon. Shalom.
Welcome. I am so happy that you decided to join me. I have a privilege today that I'm so excited about to tell you about a holiday that is incredibly meaningful to me. I want to talk to you about Passover. And you know, I get to talk to Christian audiences from time to time about Passover and explain things. And one of the things that I realized that a lot of what Christians know about Passover, it mostly has to do with Easter. When we talk about Passover, the way Jewish Passover is celebrated, the way Jesus would have celebrated Passover 2,000 years ago in Jerusalem, that is something that many people are really missing. So I am excited because I have an opportunity today to introduce you, to walk you through a traditional Jewish meal, the types of things that would have happened in Passover thousands of years ago. Some of the traditions that I will mention and talk about really stretch back thousands of years. Some of them maybe not quite as old. Some of them are maybe hundreds of years old. But what I'm sharing with you is cultural knowledge and customs and traditions that I believe will give you an incredible insight into what was going on at that Passover table when Jesus celebrated Passover in Jerusalem all those years back. Who would not want to know what happened in that upper room? I think for Christians, that is a very meaningful moment that their faith is built on. And I think for Jews, Passover is an incredibly meaningful moment as well, because our own identity as Jews is really built on the story of Exodus. So to begin with, Pesach or Passover is all about Exodus. Year after year, we're commanded to celebrate this special event. In the Torah, we read that Moses was told, "Let it," meaning Passover, "be a memorial unto you, and you are to celebrate it for all generations." So year after year, we get together, we get our families together, and we celebrate Passover, and we remember the Exodus. For Jews, Pesach or Passover is the remembrance of coming out of Egypt. And you would agree with me that this is an event of monumental proportions in our history. If you think about it, not every day God takes people and delivers and emancipates them out of slavery. This was a massive event that gave birth to a people, and it lays as the foundation of our own identity. So it has a huge meaning for Jews, and I believe Passover has a massive meaning for Christians as well, because on that night, Jesus took that cup and he raised it and said, "This is my blood." He took the bread, he said, "This is my body." This is where these things come from. And I think this moment in history that converges is so important for both communities to understand and to delve deeper into. I have the privilege of explaining some of the customs and traditions that go on at the Jewish table. And if you follow along with me and you know the story of the gospel, I think a lot of these things will start to make sense to you in a very pictorial, in a very demonstrative way. By the way, as you see my setup right now, it's set up as a dinner table. Why? Because Passover is actually a dinner. A lot of times people are used to religious events being some sort of a celebrations that happen in a place of worship. But Passover is not like that. Passover happens at home, around dinner table, with family. In fact, every dinner table is transformed into a holy place where family and friends get together and they share a meal. Just like it was commanded to Moses in Egypt to take a Passover lamb, to slaughter it and to eat it with the family and to commemorate that day. In many ways, we still continue this tradition of having a meal and recounting the things that God has done for us. So that's how Passover happens, around the dinner table, and that's what you see. Now, there's a number of items over here on this table that I will be explaining and going through one by one. But before I do that, I wanted to introduce you to something kind of foundational and cornerstone about Passover that you need to understand. First of all, in order to understand the whole Passover ceremony, you have to realize that it's centered around 4 cups. There's 4 cups of wine that we drink during Passover. And when I say 4 cups, I really mean 1 cup. We just sip out of it 4 times. But in ceremonial way, we lift up our cup and we count the promises that God has made and then promises that God has fulfilled to us. This is a ceremony of remembrance. And what we're remembering is Exodus. And you see in Exodus in chapter 6, verses 6 through 7, God gave 4 very specific promises to the community of Israel. And then he fulfilled those promises. I'm going to read just very quickly this passage to help you remember. Exodus chapter 6, verses 6 through 7, the 4 things that God said. I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. He also said, I will deliver you from your bondage. He said, I will redeem you with an outstretched arm. I will take you for my people, and I will be your God. That's promise number 4. So 4 promises are celebrated through this ceremony of lifting our cup 4 times, and 4 times in a almost toast-like fashion. We give praises to God and read special benedictions, and we remember each one of those promises being fulfilled. Because the kind of God we serve, we realize, is the kind of God who keeps his promises. He makes promises and he keeps promises. And Passover is a celebration of freedom and liberty, and God really being true to his word, keeping his promises. Now, before even Passover begins, something important to understand that sets it apart from all the holidays. You see, we go through our houses and we're commanded to rid our houses of leaven. We're not supposed to have yeast or leaven of any sorts, and so usually we go through and get rid of any product that might have it. And on Passover, we eat very unusual bread, unleavened bread, matzah. This is matzah right here. Unleavened bread is very plain, very simple. There's nothing to it. It looks like an oversized saltine cracker or something, but it's just water and flour. And it's baked in the hot oven to make crispy. So this is unleavened bread. In fact, we're commanded to eat unleavened bread all the days of Passover, and that's a total of 7 days. What is special about this commandment is the fact that what leaven represents, perhaps. If you think about it with me, a lot of times leaven in the scriptures, it represents sin or stagnation of some sort. And so we are starting anew. We get rid of all the leaven, remove leaven from our houses, and as we come to this moment, we come to this moment of celebration and purity with a new beginning. There is no yeast in this bread, and yeast, of course, and leaven occurs naturally. Fermentation is something that happens naturally with most products, but we eat this unleavened bread to remember Exodus from Egypt. Now, how is this tied to Exodus? The story tells us that when our ancestors left Egypt, they were coming out in great haste. And as they were doing it, it was time to leave, and their bread did not have time to rise. And they baked it, and it was flat, and it was unleavened. Now, of course, the bread did not have time to rise because they did not use yeast the way we use yeast today. We would go to the store and buy some yeast, mix it into a dough, and before you know it, in just a few minutes, a couple of hours, we have nice puffy loaf. But that's not how yeast worked in the ancient times. So it took considerably longer for bread to rise, and it was time to go. Their bread did not have time to rise. They just baked it quickly. They took it with them for the road, and this is what the children of Israel ate on their journey. Flat, unleavened bread. It's plain, it's simple, but it reminds us of that Exodus story. So in Jewish tradition, we call this lechem oni, the bread of suffering, the bread of our affliction. And we connect it to that Exodus journey. We connect it to slavery. So every year on Passover, that's what we eat for 7 days. There's no regular bread found in our house or red bread products of any sort, in remembrance of the Passover feast and what it represents. So now that you know a little bit about this special bread that we eat and how this time is set apart, when we sit down to celebrate it, we celebrate it just like every other major celebration with a meal, and usually it begins with the lighting of the candles. The lady of the house today would come out and light 2 candles. And this is done every Sabbath. This is done every celebration that is meaningful, every holiday. Holidays, by the way, are Sabbaths in Jewish tradition. They're times of rest in God. And so the lady of the house would come and light 2 candles. It's a curious custom that goes way back. I'm not sure how far back it goes. It probably goes back to the days of Jesus, probably even further, because since those days, they did not have paraffin candles. They would have had some oil lamps in those days, but they also would have lit 2. So it's a curious tradition. People always ask, why 2 candles? Why not 3? Why not 5? Why not 17? Why is this number? And the rabbis have a very interesting answer. The rabbis of old tell us that the reason why we light 2 lights on Passover and on any other holiday on a Sabbath is to remind us of the 2 aspects of God's commandments. You see, in one place in the Torah, God said that we shall keep the Sabbath. Now, in another instance, he says, we shall remember the Sabbath. These 2 aspects of the same commandment are not exactly the same. You see, to keep and to remember is not identical. To keep means to observe, to do it. So I can observe the Sabbath. I can get actually very carried away with all the rules and regulations and being very careful not to break any of the laws. But will I actually remember what the Sabbath is about? But then, as I remember what is Sabbath all about, it is about creation. It is about God resting from His creation and proclaiming it to be good. All of a sudden, I'm brought back to the idea of what Sabbath is really all about. And you can't have one without the other. If you just merely remember what it is, but you don't actually observe it, it doesn't quite do the same for you. So the rabbis say you have to both keep and remember, and keeping those aspects together is you have the true rest in God. Now, the 2 candles is a very curious tradition. There was a famous rabbi who lived in the Middle Ages who was asked the question once, Rabbi, why does the woman get to light the candles? And that question might sound a little bit strange to you. The truth is that Judaism is a very patriarchal religion, and men get to do all sorts of things. Historically, this is how it has been. Most of the religious functions are performed by men. And women, it's not that women are not important or not worthy. They always are doing lots of things, but not always up front. And so here is something different. The Passover celebration begins with the lighting of the candles, and it's the woman of the house who comes and lights the candles. And so the question that was asked was a very logical question. Why does the woman begin the celebration? And the rabbi answered this way. He said it was because of Eve. Eve? Well, the rabbi explained in the Garden of Eden, it was Eve who came in and she took that forbidden fruit and she ate it and she gave it to Adam to eat. And when that happened, the rabbi said the light of the world was dimmed. Now that makes sense to you and I. Perhaps you're familiar with the famous words of Jesus where he says, I am the light of the world. That is exactly what the rabbi said. The light of the world was dimmed. Now, it's interesting that rabbi says the reason why the woman gets to light the candles is because she is trying to restore that light. She's trying to bring that light back. It's as if she can undo what happened in the garden. Of course, she's not Eve, she's a descendant of Eve, but that's her way of showing what she wished could happen. We know that just a couple of candles are not going to undo what happened in the garden, but nevertheless, it's a beautiful custom, a ritual that shows the intention of a human heart to repair our relationship with God, to restore these things. So that's what these 2 candles really mean. But you know, for those of us who know the Messiah, for those of us who think about the light of God, we can't stop but to think of those words that Jesus says, I am the light of the world. And in fact, He is. You see, if you consider this, how did this light come into this world? Did this light come through a man or a woman? If you read the great Isaiahs of the great prophecies, if you read the great prophecies of Isaiah about the child who was to be born, curiously, these prophecies talk about a woman bearing a child, and the man is not involved at all. So, as far as I remember the story of Joseph and Mary, when the angel announced that Mary is going to be pregnant with child, and Joseph was not involved in that story. So you see, the light of the world did come into the world without the help of man, but just through a woman. That's why it is a woman's privilege to bring light to the world. That's why the lady of the house begins the ceremony. Every custom, every tradition, every ritual item that we have tells a story like this. And that story can be very deep depending how far we want to go to explore its symbolism. Rituals and customs, they're not just things we do. They have deep meaning and deep understanding. And I think that's how it was for ancient people as well, which is why understanding customs and how they lived in that world helps us to enter their world. That is what I am inviting you to do with me today, to enter into the ancient times and to understand how people celebrated Passover back then so that we can understand Passover the way they did. So as Passover begins and the candles are lit, we are in God's presence, illuminated by His light. We're sitting down and we're getting ready to eat. There are several things that happen right before eating. Well, first we have this 4 cups, the story of the 4 cups that I told you. The 4 cups represent 4 promises. So before we eat, we actually lift our cup and ceremonially bless it. We thank God for His salvation. This first cup in the celebration of Passover is called Kadesh Sanctification. And this is what I imagine Jesus would have done with His disciples as He celebrated. He would have lifted the cup and said words that are kind of formulaic words of Jewish prayer. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei pri hagafen. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who creates the fruit of the vine. And with these words, the cup will be sanctified and God will be thanked for the very first promise. Because remember, the first promise says, I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. That promise in Exodus 6 that I read to you earlier. So how is it tied to the first cup? How is it tied to the word Kadesh and sanctification? If you think about the word holy and sanctified, that's what it means. It means to separate, to set apart. And what God has done for us in Egypt is He set us apart. He separated us so that He can redeem us. And that's why this cup is called sanctification, because God has brought us closer to Himself. So as we lift our cup, we begin our celebration realizing that we have been sanctified for God's purposes, for His glory. And this is where we move on to actually eating and tasting some things. Now, I brought a special plate here with me, and it's set up with traditional items that we taste. It's not necessarily the dinner fare. These are the hors d'oeuvres. These are traditional items that we taste that help us to relive, to reenact the journey of Exodus. That's really what it's about. It's not about their taste. It's not about any appeal or anything like that. These items are symbolic. They help me tell the story of Exodus. But before we taste anything, there's another custom, there's another ritual that happens. I brought a special cup here with me. This is a wash cup. And traditionally, before tasting food, since the ancient days, Jews have always washed hands. Washing hands is an custom of purity, an ancient tradition that you could see all over the Bible. If you read books of the Torah like Leviticus, you will see how many times the priests would have to wash themselves before they approached God. They had to approach God, holy God, in purity, in sanctity. And that's what this celebration is all about. In fact, the outfit that I'm wearing, this white robe, kittel, represents purity. I'm wearing a representation of a priestly robe. Not the high priest who did all the important things in the temple, but the average priest who brought sacrifices. They wore plain white tunics, and that's what I'm wearing. It's a representation of purity before God. And as the priests served before God, what they did were sacrifices. Sacrifices are holy. They belong to God, and purity was absolutely necessary. So that means washing your hands, that means washing your feet, that it means being clean and pure before God. Of course, we realize we cannot wash away our impurity, our sin with mere water. That is but a symbol. But nevertheless, it's a very effective symbol that shows to us the intention of our hearts. Lord, we say, we want to be clean and pure before you. We know we can't do it ourselves. No amount of water is going to truly purify us. But Lord, accept this act as our show, as our display, as our desire to show that we want to be pure before you. That is the intent of our hearts. So we wash our hands before we touch food, which is reminiscent of so many passages in the Bible. Maybe you remember a story when and Pharisees came to Jesus and they said, Rabbi, why do your disciples eat with unwashed hands? Remember that story in Mark chapter 7? It's also in Matthew 15. It's a curious story, but if you remember, it was about washing of hands. And they were criticizing his disciples, and then Jesus, of course, went into a long story, a long sort of, a sermon about what's unclean, what's clean, what goes in, what goes out. That's not the reason why I bring up this passage. I simply want you to remember that in the first century, in the days of Jesus, hand washing was a natural ritual. And when somebody did not follow it, other Jews found it to be unusual. They thought, why not? They had questions to ask. So, of course, for many pious Jews in the era of Jesus, they chose to celebrate Passover and anytime they ate food, in a state of ritual purity. You see, the ancient rabbis thought to themselves, if the priests in the temple can eat food in ritual purity, and that is the way they worship God, that is the way they bring Him honor, why can't we have our table to be representative of those sacrifices? Why can't we eat food in a state of ritual purity? Why can't we have a meal with God, essentially? And if we can do that, then of course purity rules that apply to the priests now all of a sudden apply to us. Why? Because if we're inviting God to be at our table, then we need to be pure before Him. And that's the idea of eating with God, so to say, that developed in the first century and probably prior to that time, which is why people wash their hands and cleanse themselves before partaking any food. And this custom continues till today. Till today in Jewish community, people wash their hands ceremonially right before partaking of the meal. Now, the special plate that I brought with me is called the Seder Plate. That is not such an ancient item. I'm pretty sure that Moses didn't have one of those. I don't think Jesus would have had one of those either. This is more of a modern creation, but it made it so nice and simple where I have a plate with special spots on it, and every spot houses a traditional food that we eat on Passover. And it's just a nice arrangement because it allows me to tell the story. In fact, every little spot is labeled with a name, like this one says Zroa in Hebrew, so I know exactly what it is, so I can read it, and this is like my outline that helps me tell the story, essentially. But the Seder Plate, even though that is perhaps a more newer custom, the custom of telling the story through eating traditional foods is a very old custom. Now, we always begin the story of Passover and the eating of traditional foods with the first item called the karpas. Karpas is a green leafy plant of some sort. It doesn't really matter what it is so much as what it does. Karpas is supposed to be a bitter herb. It could be parsley, it could be cilantro, it could be a number of different bitter herbs that we eat. And the reason, of course, it is bitter is to remind us of the bitterness of slavery, because slavery in Egypt was terrible. It says that Israelites were afflicted with all sorts of labor and they were suffering. So we eat a little bit of karpas to help us remember the bitterness. Many of us today can't imagine what it's like to be a slave. We have been born free, and so it's difficult for us. We may think about it in our heads, but to experience it, we help ourselves by tasting something very bitter. But however, before we taste something bitter, there's another custom we follow. We always have a little bit of salt water on our tables, and so salt water helps us to make the bitter herb even more bitter. The tradition is to dip the karpas twice into salt water. And of course, then when we taste it, you can imagine if I have a bitter herb and I put it into salt water, it's definitely not going to make it taste better. It's going to make it taste even more bitter, which is the whole point of this exercise. The bitterness of slavery, and some people say that the salt water represents the tears of slavery. Now, there's another beautiful custom that explains to us that the first time I dip the karpas into salt water, it represents how God opened the Red Sea. And the second time I dip the karpas into salt water, it represents how God closed the Red Sea and the Israelite slaves passed through safely, but the Egyptian army has drowned. So you could see how simple items like some bitter herbs and some salt water can help me retell the story. So after we dip it into the sea or the tears of slavery and we taste this bitter herb, we're starting to actually taste the Passover. We are experiencing it. This is the first type of reenactment where we are feeling the story. We're tasting the story as we are telling it at the table. As I said, this is not the actual meal. These are just the traditional foods that we do taste. We actually break for the meal, which is usually quite elaborate. But after we taste the karpas, and we've tasted the bitterness of slavery and the tears of slavery, we move on to breaking of the matzah. I already told you a little bit about the matzah, the special unleavened bread that we have on our table, and that's the only kind of bread we eat during Passover. I brought a special bag here with me, and this is called a matzah tosh. Inside the matzah tosh are 3 pieces of unleavened bread, 3 pieces of matzah. And so according to tradition, in this point of the celebration, a middle piece is taken out of the bag, and it is broken in half, or sort of in half. It rarely happens perfectly, but I put one of the pieces on the plate, and the other one I'm going to wrap, and the tradition is to hide it until the end of the celebration. The tradition is to put it aside and save it away, and it's usually taken out of sight. A lot of times I like to play a game with my kids, and a lot of families do that, where we hide this piece of matzah, and then later children have to find it. After they find it, they have to bring it to me, and I actually buy it back from them. I ransom it from them for some money, for some prize. So usually there's a reward that comes for finding that special piece of matzah. Now, at this point, I'm not going to tell you what this piece of matzah means. I'm not going to tell you what it represents. I just want you to remember what I did. I took this bag, the one that contains 3 pieces of matzah. I took one out. They're all together, and I took one out. I broke it, and I hid it. And later in the ceremony, I come back to it, and it actually plays a very central role. But this is called yachatz, the separation of matzah, the separation of the afikomen. Now, after the breaking of the matzah, we usually continue with telling the story of Passover. One of the main parts of the Passover celebration is telling of the story. We call it the Magid, the actual narrative of Passover. I'm not going to do this with you today because it takes a while to retell the whole story of Exodus, even if I was summarizing it. I'm going to trust that you actually know the story of Exodus and you remember how the children of Israel came to be in Egypt and how they came out of Egypt. I would like to focus on just one aspect of the story, just to kind of make things a little bit shorter. Usually, as we tell the story, everyone does it differently. Sometimes we ask questions. The kids, there's traditional questions that children ask at the table, and then the adults give answers. There's a story about 4 sons. Some people like to sing songs. Some people like to retell and actually read passages from the Bible. Or there's this nice paraphrase that the rabbis have put together that kind of tells the story of Passover. Everybody does it differently, and everybody does it in their own way. A lot of times the families participate, but everyone that tells the story of Passover comes to this moment in the story, and that is sort of, say, the pivotal part of the story. This is one of the central scenes of Passover. If I don't mention this, I really didn't do my job when it comes to Passover, and it's the story of the 10 plagues. You see, 10 plagues are central. Imagine what would Passover story be without the 10 plagues. How did the 10 plagues come to be? If you remember, when Moses was called to be the savior of Israelites, God called him in the wilderness. It was the burning bush story. Of course, Moses resisted, but God said, I will give you my power, and you will go before Pharaoh, and you will say, let my people go. And then God tells him, I am going to harden Pharaoh's heart. And he's not going to let the people go. Well, I always read this passage with a little bit of a smile on my face because I think about it. What kind of a job are you asking Moses to do where you're telling him he's not going to succeed right away? He doesn't have a lot of confidence in himself to begin with. Why would God do this? But there's, of course, a purpose to the story. Because from the very beginning, God wanted to show something to his people. Pharaoh hardens his heart. He does not let the people go. Just having Moses come before him and saying, let my people go, does not do the job. He has to be convinced to let the people go. And this is where the story of the 10 plagues come in. So everyone tells the story, and actually at the table what we do is we recount plague by plague by plague. There's a very interesting custom that we like to follow at Passover. The second cup, a lot of times, we call this the cup of plagues sometimes, okay? And it coincides to that second promise where God says, first, I'm going to separate you unto myself, and then God is saying that I'm going to deliver you from your oppressors. So the second cup is how God delivers us. He's going to lead us out of the land, but he's going to do this through the story of plagues. So this is what's actually done in every Jewish home as people celebrate and remember the plagues. They recall the plagues one by one by one. Now, plagues were terrible, and if I think about it, these are punishments that God sent upon the Egyptians. Every time Pharaoh said no, God did something terrible, and not just Pharaoh and his house, but the whole land of Egypt suffers, while Israelites are actually kept safe. And so the rabbi tell us that when we come to the cup, and our cup is full, a full cup is a symbol of joy. Now, all these things that Israelites did not suffer, but the Egyptians did suffer, we should not rejoice in the downfall of somebody who has suffered. Basically, so the rabbis say we must diminish our cup just a tiny bit, make it not 100% full, so that when we drink from it, our joy is not complete, because a full cup is a symbol of joy, but if it's not 100% full, then our joy is not 100%. So that's what we do, is we actually take out 10 drops out of our cups, one drop at a time, recalling the plagues. And I'm going to do this for you today. The plagues are these. We have first plague is dam, which is blood. Then we have tsephardeia, which is frogs. Then we have kinim, lice. Orov, wild animals. We have dever, the livestock plague, when the animals died. We have shechin, boils. Barad, hail. Arbe, locusts. And we have choshech, darkness. And we have makat bichorot, the last and the terrible plague, the slaying of the firstborn. These are the 10 plagues. And after we take out these 10 drops from the cup, we're ready to actually drink it. And remember that second stage in our deliverance, that God has redeemed us, but not just redeemed us. He redeemed us with signs and wonders and miracles. Have you ever wondered why God delivered Israelites the way he did? Why were all these signs and wonders necessary? Why was it necessary for God to harden Pharaoh's heart so that later he can soften him through all the suffering and all the punishments? Well, the truth is, imagine yourself being an Israelite and in slavery for hundreds of years. You believe in this God who made promises to your forefather Abraham, who said that he's going to bless and multiply and do all these wonderful things, but you find yourself in Egypt as a slave, working for Pharaoh, making bricks in a hot Egyptian sun, day after day, day after day, and you look around and you say, is this the kind of life that God really wanted me to have? Is what he meant by all those wonderful promises? So I can just imagine how many people would throw up their hands to the sky and just scream and say, Lord, why? Why is this happening to me? Why are we slaves? I wonder how many people would actually lose their faith because their conditions are so terrible. And while this God who supposedly loves them promised them blessings, they're not experiencing those blessings at that moment. So it would be very difficult to keep the faith, essentially, while you are slave and you're afflicted and beaten and starved. And so when we get to the story, that's why the plagues had to come. Imagine how many people's faith in this one God must have wavered. Maybe they came to believe that some of the gods of Egypt are the ones who are powerful, because after all, they gave Pharaoh the power to enslave them. But you see, the God of Israel had to show that he is greater than all the gods of Egypt. And that's why when Moses came to the river Nile, and Nile is actually connected to one of the deities, and he would put his stick into River Nile and turn it into blood. And it turned into blood. The God of the Nile River could not reverse that, could not change it, could not compete with that. It took Moses' action again to turn it back, and on and on and on. Every plague that we read about, every plague that we remember in the story of Exodus is really an illustration to the children of Israel that God is real and that He's more powerful than this deity in Egypt. He's more powerful than that deity in Egypt. He's more powerful than this God. He's more powerful than that God, and on and on and on, to embarrass the deities of Egypt and to show that God of Israel is one true God.
Loose from infirmities and disabilities, loose from all that hinders me. Nothing can hold me now. I'm standing on solid ground. The word of the Lord. I've got the victory over my enemies. Who the Son sets free is free indeed. My chains are broken. Thank God I am loose. Oh, yes I am, yes I am. I am loose. Oh, yes.